My name is Natalie Stetler. My major is political science and my research interest is forced migration. I don't think I have to actually tell you guys what forced migration is, so we can probably skip past those things. But the goal of my research is to identify factors that affect the integration of recently resettled refugees into their new societies. Specifically, what explains why some South Asian refugees are successfully integrating into the United States while others are not. Using the case of newly resettled Bhutanese refugees, my research analyzes the impact of demographic, socioeconomic, and political factors on the integration of refugees in Michigan. And this is the research I reviewed prior to conducting my own, which suggested multiple conceptual frameworks for integration. And for my research, I argue that resettled individuals' willingness to allow their child to marry an American is a true measure of integration. While this may not be the most accurate measure of integration, I argue that resettled individuals who support intermarriage with Americans, accept American culture, and view themselves as a part of American society. While intermarriage across ethnic groups is a characteristic of American culture, it is forbidden in many South Asian cultures, including the Bhutanese, Nepali.
Could you go back one slide? Yes.
You've read all of them, right?
Okay. Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Based on my theory, I developed some hypotheses. While not all resettled refugees might be willing to support intermarriage, those who arrived with a higher level of education, at least some formal education when they came to the United States, are more likely to support intermarriage, which leads to my first hypothesis. Additionally, older generations are typically more traditional and have stronger cultural ties to their native country, which leads to my second hypothesis. Third, individuals with higher incomes tend to have more external contacts outside of their cultural community, which leads to my third hypothesis. And fourth, the individuals who voted in the last presidential election are more likely to support intermarriage as they are fulfilling a civic duty to the United States who supports intermarriage, which leads to my fourth hypothesis. And fifth, individuals who frequently interact with individuals outside of their own community and culture are more likely to be exposed to American culture, which leads to my fifth hypothesis. And then my sixth hypothesis, respondents who arrived earlier and spent longer periods of time in the United States are more likely to be familiar with American practices. Data for my research comes from a survey conducted by my mentor, Dr. Prakash Adhikari, and his colleagues. The sample for this survey is 102 newly resettled former Bhutanese refugees living in Michigan. The survey utilized both snowball and respondent-driven sampling. Snowball sampling relies on referrals from initially known subjects to identify additional subjects, while for this survey, the number of referrals was limited to reduce sample bias. And respondent-driven sampling was used to protect the identities of those who wish to remain anonymous due to stigmatization, as well as address the issues of inference and generalizability caused by snowball sampling. Dr. Adhikari and his team identified potential survey respondents using ties to the Bhutanese community of Michigan, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting former refugees living in the state of Michigan, as well as two vologs, Bethany Christian Services located in Grand Rapids and St. Vincent Catholic Charities located in Lansing. VOLOG stands for Voluntary Refugee Resettlement Agencies, who work to successfully resettle refugees across the United States. The first stage of survey administration began in January 2020. Trained enumerators conducted in-person interviews using paper and pencil. However, Dr. Adhikari and his team were forced to shut down interviews in March of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. Second phase of survey administration began in summer of 2021. The survey was made available online using Qualtrics. However, Dr. Adhikari and his colleagues quickly learned that a large percentage of the respondents were illiterate. And so to overcome this challenge, trained enumerators were trained to conduct the online survey in person. And the data from my paper comes from the second phase of the survey conducted in fall of 21 in spring of 22. The dependent variable in my research is a dichotomous measure of integration. dependent variable integration in my research is a dichotomous measure of whether or not respondents would allow their child to marry an American. Respondents were asked, would you allow your child to marry an American? Positive responses coded as 1, negative is 0. My independent variables are age, education, net annual income, social network, participation in the last presidential election, and year of resettlement to the United States. Our sample size of 102 is not large enough to conduct an empirical analysis, so at this point I'm just presenting results from cross-tabulations. First, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be statistically insignificant between respondents whose monthly income exceeded $3,000 per month and whose monthly income was less than $3,000 per month. So I found no significant difference between these two groups. And then next, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be statistically significant between those who did vote in the last presidential election and those who did not vote in the last presidential election. Of those who did vote in the last presidential election, 72% would allow their child to marry an American. I argue this can partly be explained by the fact that only former refugees who have naturalized into American citizens have the right to vote, although further research needs to be conducted in this area. Also, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be insignificant between respondents who had spent less than 10 years in the United States and respondents who had spent more than 10 years in the United States. And then, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be statistically significant between those who had received at least some formal education upon arrival to the United States and those who had not received any formal education upon arrival to the United States. Of those who had not received any formal education, 76% would not allow their child to marry an American, while of those who had received at least some formal education, 73% would allow their child to marry an American. Next, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be statistically significant between those without external social interactions and those with external social interactions. Of those without social external interactions, 61% would not allow their child to marry an American, while of those with external social interactions, 75% would allow their child to marry an American. And finally, using a chi-squared test, I found the difference in attitudes towards intermarriage to be statistically significant between those who were above the age of 40 and those who were below the age of 40. Of those below the age of 40, 82% would allow their child to marry an American, while of those above the age of 40, 81% would not allow their child to marry an American. Findings from my research are expected to better inform the public as well as policymakers about why some resettled refugees are integrating while others are not. It is my hope that my findings will encourage policymakers to make improvements to federal, state, and local integration processes across the United States for the over 80 million refugees still waiting in camps. So my references, and I would like to thank the Bhutanese community of Michigan and Dr. Prakash Adhikari for making this project possible.